Welcome. Do find a seat, and very pleased to see you. We also have lots of people who've joined us online. I'm really delighted to welcome Ian, Evie and Ben, who's in the audience. So Ian Loader is Professor of Criminology and Director of the Centre for Criminology at the University of Oxford. Evie Gurley is an anthropologist and Senior Lecturer in Criminology in the School of Social Sciences. And Ben Bradford, who's with us and who'll join us for the question and answer session, is Professor of Global City Policing at University College London. We also have Richard Sparks, who's with us online. So with Richard, three presenters have recently completed fieldwork on a 3-year study entitled Place, Crime and Insecurity in Everyday Life, funded by the ESRC. So the study investigates how people living in one English town, Macclesfield in Cheshire, talk about and act towards a range of threats that they regard as impinging on their safety. And this is a revisit of a study that they carried out in the same town 25 years ago, the results of which are published in that book, even if it's displaying. And I remember all of that. I've lived it a little bit vicariously with them. And so I was really excited when they said that they were returning to this study, and I'm very interested in the methodological questions. I heard them present on this study at the ESC this year and found their analysis of people's everyday experiences of security and insecurity against the backdrop of rapid social, political and technological change, but also their experience of returning to a former place and project. Fascinating. So I'm very much looking forward to an update. So welcome, we're delighted to have you, and over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Alison. We're here today to talk about to reflect on us revisiting a former side of research. Between 1994 and 1996, three of us, Ian, Richard and myself, conducted a study on fear of crime and crime talk in a small town, an English town in the northwest of England, about 20 miles south of Manchester. And along the main train line from Manchester to London. Population about 52,000, 52,500 currently. So for those who don't know Macclesfield, this is kind of roughly where it is and what the place is like. But in terms of revisiting, there were a number of people in our team over the years. It was a 3-year project, but because of the pandemic, it stretched. Like everything else, time stretched in the middle of the project, in the early times of the project. So over the 4 years we were conducting this research, lots of people joined us on that route. Ben, who hadn't been to Macclesfield before, was there from the beginning. But also along the way, we had Gosia Polanska and Ryan Casey, who were researchers on the team, and Serkan Bahetsi from Coldsmiths was also on the team. So some of us had been there in our youth, in our kind of 30s, and some people joined us later on. Some people knew about criminology in the book, Ben may have had when they joined us, but some of the other researchers that we recruited, for them it was an entirely kind of new topic and new engagement with this place. So we have 2 research projects conducted 25 years apart, both funded by the ESRC. Interestingly, the first project was funded under the Crime and Social Order Programme, whereas this one was funded, did not belong to a programme, and that tells you a little bit about the kind of the place of crime and interest in kind of research and crime in terms of funding. So let's talk a little bit about just a very short account of Macclesfield 1, the mid-1990s, a bit about the backdrop of the mid-1990s. So the backdrop to our original study was a time in which anxiety about crime was a prominent and highly charged topic of media discourse and political combat. It was also a time when you would expect to hear crime in pubs. And I remember when we were talking about crime talk and investigate crime talk, we wanted to find out how conversations about crime unfolded, how people talked about it in their everyday lives, and that's what kind of led us to explore focus groups, to explore natural settings in which people would engage in conversations about crime. So we chose Macclesfield because it wasn't a big city where most of the research on crime took place at the time, and maybe still takes place at this time. And we also chose it because it was a relatively safe place. But it did have its own problems, its pockets of deprivation, concerns about particular issues that animated the town in terms of kind of safety and order. And I work when against the grain of traditional of problem chasing in criminology. We wanted to explore crime talk in a place where a crime was not perceived to be a problem. In terms of kind of both in terms of kind of academic research, but also in terms from the perspective of those people who come to live there. And indeed, one of the reactions of people when we first approached them in Macclesfield, why are you here? One of the first things, both in the first study and the second study, there was puzzlement that somebody who's interested in crime and criminology would want to come and study a place such as Macclesfield, which is might be relatively uninteresting in terms of the scale of crime problem and so on. And as one Macclesfield resident put it in 1996, it was as good a place as any and better than most. So why are you here? So the question about why we're interested in Macclesfield. And the question about crime and public life in 1990s Britain was an increasingly central political question, and it actually became so even more so immediately after we finished our research. We finished in 1996, and subsequently with New Labour, antisocial behaviour orders, and the kind of whole discourse around that, this became an even more central issue. And in fact, when people were talking to us in the 1990s, they hardly ever used the term antisocial behaviour. Looking back and reading what our participants were telling us, it fitted within the concerns about antisocial behaviour that came to dominate kind of political discourse around crime in the years that followed our research. But during that particular period, people were talking about behaviour that would have now be labelled as antisocial, but they were not using precisely those terms to do it. So we were at the cusp of a number of changes at that point in our first research. By the way, we had a tendency to use black and white photos when we talk about our earlier research. The world was in colour at that time, but the photos we commissioned to capture the project were in black and white. So, but it's very useful now because it punctuates the passage of time every time we use this black and white photos. So let's think a little bit about what our participants were telling us then. And I think before I go on to that, I want to kind of make the point that our orientation at the time was very specifically around place, globalization, and risk. And we were interested in the kind of fate of place and the kind of fate of security and insecurity in light of kind of globalizing influence, quite widespread debates in sociology and geography at that time about the fate of places and what happens to places and those within them under conditions of globalization. So we were very much sort of firmly placed within those debates, our work, and to give a kind of summary of the kind of things that people were talking to us about, people were concerned about burglary, and traveling criminals was one of the main, the term traveling crime was used both by police officers and the police and security providers who talked to us at the time, but also by residents of Macclesfield. They were also concerned about theft of and damage to cars, young people hanging around. And it's interesting, this is the kind of equivalent got translated later on to antisocial behaviour, kind of morphed into something else later on. They were also had a nostalgic kind of disposition towards the absence of police authority. And that is both visible, the visibility of police. There were debates around police officers staying in their Panda cars, which was the mode of transport at the time, but also the kind of the absence of police authority in that the authority that police officers would have of a particular people in particular situations to control order in the town. So it was both a kind of an absence of a physical absence of the police, but also kind of an absence of decline in perceived kind of police authority to resolve situations compared to perceived kind of pasts, which many of our participants at that time longed for. So we documented and analysed the ways in which crime worked metaphorically as a condensing symbol of wider social and cultural change, both national and global, from which local life was felt to offer some degree of protection. And I think this is where we'll talk about it a bit later on. This is where one of the main differences between our earlier study and this study, because we have begun to see that crime is no longer that condensing symbol that would describe the kind of the hopes and aspirations of local life. So a bit more about that later on. So what did we do? Before I get to what we did, I want to talk a little bit about the kind of changes that we expected, some of the changes that we expected before we started the research. So we knew we were going to the same place, but we had a question mark there. Was it the same place? A lot of the way of talking, another one concerns about the future of towns under conditions of globalization and places, but it was more about kind of homogenization and more becoming, all towns kind of becoming the same or similar. Some of the concerns about place and towns like Macclesfield has morphed into concerns about the very kind of economic and cultural life viability of towns, a much more visceral concern about the future of towns and town centres, the economy of towns, what makes livable spaces on a small scale in which to conduct secure lives. So that's one of the kind of changes that has occurred, and Ian will probably talk more about this. So it's still relatively the same as it was in the 1990s, and it's still predominantly white, even though it's more diverse than it was in the 1990s. So we anticipated, in fact, as part of our research proposal, we anticipated that there would be this sort of context. And in fact, that's why we wanted to do the research. That was also what's prompting us to do the research. When we did the 1990s research, it was the first days of email. When we were going back to Macclesfield in 2019, we have global search engines, we have social media platforms, we had the kind of new media context in which communication about crime was happening. So the digital revolution, and we did consider for a while, should we include social media and kind of a digital sort of context in our research? And we decided that we couldn't really not do it. And I think it's a question for future research as well. You can make manageable research projects, ethnographies of place in which you don't, you decide that is too much. That is too much to do. To include the online life of people and the kind of physical moving around places and thinking about places. But we decided that it was something that we had to do. We had to try and do it, despite this kind of methodological challenges. And even though we were also kind of concerned about the kind of marking of time, this idea of return, moving from one time to another as returning, our whole field was marking time during our during the intervening period. So there was kind of concern about austerity and its effects and what it meant about the future of places. And so concern about the future and then the kind of depletion of places and services was one that was part of our field, a very prominent part of our field. There was the impact of Brexit and its cultural politics, especially around migration. We expected the impact of climate consciousness in our proposal, but it was, if I remember, it was a bit towards the end of our proposal. All these other things came first. But as it turned out, and as Ian will describe, that was a much more prominent aspect of people's sense of insecurity in Macclesfield. And one thing that we didn't kind of factor in was COVID-19, which we started the research in November 2019. We were about to go into the field late February, beginning of March, and of course then we couldn't reach Macclesfield. And this is an ongoing debate within the team about how do we treat this kind of punctuation of time between, with the pandemic restrictions. And there's a number of ways in which we can think about it. One of the ways is that, especially in our early interviews, the COVID-19 punctuated their sense of time. This was something that happened. There was the before and after. There was also ways in which they talked about place in a more intimate way, that they had got to know it because they were restricted to living in that place. They were using the pubs more. They were aware of their neighbors more, and so on. So COVID-19 and this kind of punctuation of time is important was important for our participants, but it was also important for us, and we couldn't get to it. And of course, this is where the digital revolution made a huge difference, because we couldn't get to it physically, but we could get to it digitally. And that's when, again, some of the methodological challenges of trying to make an ethnography that is sensitive to the online world, sort of emerged, because we could find out a lot of things about it. I from Google Maps, I was able to have walked every street of Macclesfield, being frustrated because we couldn't get there. So there was a sense in which we walked those streets, and we were familiar with a kind of with the Macclesfield from afar in those early days. So when we returned to Macclesfield, our study was not a replication. We never aimed for it to be that. Our first study was the first study which Ian and Richard actually had envisaged. Was very much anchored in developing and moving beyond the fear of crime debates and concerns within criminology. And we approached our new engagement with Macclesfield afresh. So we wanted to carry out the local study of what it means to feel and be secure in Britain today. And this is where we tried to move beyond the kind of crime talk to questions about what makes people feel safe and seek better and understand better and more livable lives in the local areas where they live. So we developed this idea of a good town. What should a good town look like? And these kind of questions were there in our proposal. But in fact, this is how conducting research in a real kind of world situation with COVID. This is one of the questions that local authorities were asking, and residents were very engaged with. What makes a good town? What makes viable towns? What kind of places do we want to live in? And that kind of became woven into our questions. We wanted to find out what troubles afflict the daily lives of people across the town. And the questions that we asked, we used the word troubles for the most. What troubles people around here? What troubles you about the area where you live? And this was the vocabulary of our interviews and qualitative research. And we're also interested, as in our earlier research, about what actions people take or what demands to the make of responsible authorities to deal with the things that threaten them. And it's interesting because you would think that the thing that would be most interesting about is about what actions do they demand. But the most interesting question was, who do they demand it from? And that was a kind of a tangible change from our early research, because the police became less the authority to go to demand change, and Ian will outline who people tended to go to demand to deal with the things that are. So in terms of our methods, we talk to people individually and in small groups. We had focus groups, we had biographical interviews, we had individual interviews. Some of this was the kind of impact of COVID meant that we couldn't get people together in focus groups at first. So we ended up doing more individual interviews than focus groups. We did 2 local surveys in 2021 and 2022, and Ben will talk about the numbers. I've got them here. We talked to 416 people in the first wave of the survey, and the second wave of the survey we talked to 502 people. We decided to do it in 2 waves because we wanted to capture the mood, capture the views of people in the aftermath of the pandemic. So we did a face-to-face survey in the summer of 2021, and one of the kind of first things that we did. We carried out documentary analysis of a local policy document, a lot of consultations. And the gamut of consultations range for consultations about what should happen to the kind of local pavilion in terms of what kind of building should go there. A lot of it was about traffic, a lot of it was about kind of helping others and so on. So the range of consultations that happened, the plethora of consultations that happened during the time provided an interesting kind of source of useful data for us. And as with our main questions, we didn't necessarily look for crime-related data. Some of the things that troubled people, for example, were new developments and their impact on their environment. So we followed the documentary research to look at planning applications and objections and the way in which people talked about the things that threatened them and the things that they were concerned about in those applications. We also analyzed social media. We collected data from Twitter. So first of all, we collected data from different kind of official organizations that tweeted about Macclesfield. We collected data about microplaces in Macclesfield. We also carried out observation of Facebook groups, publicly available, publicly open Facebook groups around the town. We participated in many local groups and events. Another kind of unanticipated outcome of the pandemic, because when we first wanted to get out, there were a lot of community groups who were organizing things to get people going, to get people involved in gardening projects, to get people involved in helping others in the aftermath of the pandemic. So we got involved in different groups, anything from knitting groups to gardening groups to warm spaces groups that met once a week and provided, for example, warm lunch for people during the very cold period of last year and so on, still going on this year. We observed public spaces, took part in many kind of public events in the town. We also talked to police officers, both managers and PCSOs and police officers. We also carried out a few hundred hours of observations with PCSOs, and as well as observing the work of parking enforcement officers and the local group, the street angels, who look after the people who find themselves in sticky situations after a night out in the town. So we have a range of kind of new methods, which are more, to some extent, more ethnographic than our first project, which was much more geared towards interview and focus group research. Did that take too long?
No.
Okay.
It's going to be a seamless transition. Right, thank you. What I want to do in the remainder of our time this afternoon is not so much talk about the findings, though there will be some reporting of findings in what I have to say, but more engage in a kind of reflection on some of the meanings and analytical challenges of returning to or revisiting a research site 25 years later. And the nature of some of those challenges were rather nicely outlined by the anthropologist Clifford Geertz around the time we were doing our original study, which you can see in the quote behind me. Now, spoiler alert. Well, no, not spoiler alert. Spoiler. I think that, as will become clear, the outcome of this thinking, at least in my mind, is that these questions have ended up being less interesting to us than I thought they might once be, or at least not interesting in a way that severs them from the project you're currently engaged in and trying to make sense of. And Alison's been a great help in assisting us in that respect without her knowing it. So I'm going to return to that question at the end. But along the way, I think there are lots of interesting things that do warrant some discussion. Now, the first thing to say is that in trying to think about this question, to try and reflect upon the kind of what it means to revisit an old research site and make sense of it again 25 years later, there are a number of potential resources on what we can draw. This is especially true if you locate what we're doing in a kind of tradition of what's sometimes called community studies, because around various parts of the world, it's actually quite a common practice for places to be restudied. Sometimes by the same research team, sometimes by an entirely new set of researchers who go back and look at an old study and revisit it. The most common example of this is Muncie in Indiana, the most studied town on the planet, originally studied by the Linds in the 1920s. The latest version of that study, which has been about questions of race in Indiana, have been produced only in the last decade. But Muncie is by no means alone. I mean, closer to home, you can think about Banbury in Oxfordshire, or the Isle of Sheppey in London. There are instances of scholars in anthropology and sociology doing the kind of thing that we have done, which we've been able to draw. There is also a kind of smaller kind of methodological literature trying to reflect on the kind of theoretical and methodological challenges involved in studying the same, that's begging the question, the same place, a period of time apart. Now, it's true to say, I don't think we found this literature as interesting or as helpful as we once thought it would be, partly because it's, lots of it is kind of oriented to the whole questions of replication. And it's a bit, to my mind, kind of unhelpfully tied up in a whole series of questions to do with kind of validity and validity as between the first and the second study. You know, as Evie just said, it was never our intention for this to be a replication. I mean, though some of the methods are the same, there is a kind of family resemblance between the general orientation and questions of the study. It's not been a replication. Nor is it ever been our intention, and you discover that this sometimes happens in the wider field of the social sciences, to return to the original study and ask ourselves the question, did we get that right first time round? And there's a whole bunch of people who go around doing that, usually not on their own work, but on somebody else's work. In fact, the whole purpose of this study was to develop and revise the original project with a view to trying to make sense of the everyday security concerns of people living in this place, in this particular moment in time. And doing that actually required us to somehow rescue Macclesfield from the preoccupations of 1990s criminology in order to be able to understand it afresh. And in that case, it struck me that the purpose of the original text is as a kind of object and a set of findings and methods and so on and so forth that we can think with and against in trying to understand the place now. It's also worth mentioning, I think this is just an aside, that to some extent, there is nothing peculiar about something that is consciously a revisit. There is an important sense in which all sociological research is revisiting something which has already been interpreted by the people that whose lives we're trying to make sense of. Third thing to say, well, this is where Alison became rather helpful, but I'm going to put a pin in this because I'm going to come back to that right at the end of the talk and stick in the tradition of community studies. Now, in this context, I think the most useful paper that we found is one by Michael Borrowood called Reflexive Ethnography, and it's useful for two reasons. One of which, and it's a kind of panoramic survey of all kinds of work in this kind. One is in providing a kind of, I think, a really helpful typology of the different forms that revisits can take. He describes these things as the rolling revisit, the punctuated revisit, long-term field work, the heuristic revisit. And secondly, in providing a kind of framework within which we can think about the range of questions that I think come up in the process of revisiting sites. So, one of the forms of revisits that Borrowood describes in this research is what he describes as a revisit as a focused dialogue between the original and the present study. And that's probably come closest to what we think we're doing and how we think about the relationship between what we're doing now and what we did 25 years ago. He also develops this rather neat, in some ways, when you stop and think about it, quite obvious and simple typology for thinking about what or who may have changed between two periods of research activity in the same fieldwork site. Now, so some of these, in his view, have to do with the researcher themselves, both their relationship to the field, in all kinds of ways that kind of mattered to us. This was the first project I did after my PhD. I went back 25 years later with a string of publications to my name, a different job, a profile you could Google that was true of all of us. So our own individual kind of places in the wider world of academia and our own relationship to that place in all kinds of ways was very different 25 years on than it was first time round. Secondly, he said we could have changed. We could because consciously or less consciously, we could bring to the field a different set of theoretical lenses or orientations that mean that we are basically looking at the same place through a different kinds of eyes. But secondly, he says it's also possible that the place that we're trying to study and make sense of in all kinds of ways could have changed, either because some of practices that were internal, though this is obviously a distinction you can't sharply make, or because a whole series of forces in the external world could have just transformed the, in this case, town that you were studying, so that though it bears the same name in all kinds of ways, you might just be not studying the same place as you were 25 years ago. So what I really want to do is to use this not in any kind of rigid and formalistic way, but as a kind of loose frame for just thinking through some of the contrasts that have occurred, that have come up in the research that I'm just going to run you through, some of which are in the form of, we think, findings, and some of them are in the form of, we think, different orientations of ours, though that trying to disentangle those two things is actually extremely complicated. So here we go. So let's start at the beginning with this, the deceptively simple question: what is Macclesfield? Now, in the first study, Macclesfield, as this was kind of alluded to in the title of the book, Macclesfield kind of stood for a category that we called Middle England. And Middle England back in the mid-1990s had both a kind of sociological and a political referent. Sociologically, it was a term around to describe a particular kind of class position and associated habitus. In other words, to describe a section of the population that was getting on in life, was aspiring to do better for their family and so on and so forth, but hadn't become so economically secure that they could rid themselves of the fear of falling. So they were constantly looking forward, but also at the same time looking behind them. And that this, the argument went, created the conditions under which all kinds of anxieties pervaded that class position, some of which might have to do with questions about crime and disorder, for example, their relationship to house prices. But Middle England was also at the time a kind of political category. It was a kind of shorthand for what sometimes got described as the floating voter or the median voter. And those with long memories of English politics will know Mondeo man, Worcester woman. In other words, that section of the population who aren't kind of tied tribally to any particular political party and whose votes under a first past the post system basically swing the outcome of any particular general election. So the creating of coalitions of support around crime was one of the ways in which Middle England at the time kind of mattered politically. Now, I think to cut a very long story short, what's happened in the subsequent 25 years is that the term Middle England has either been evacuated as a category or largely fallen into disuse, leaving us to think afresh about the question, well, what is Macclesfield and what is it standing for? No, in other words, why would you study this place now and what do you think you're studying when you do it? And we continue to grapple with how to answer that question. One answer to that question is it stands for a kind of non-metropolitan ordinariness. And I say that in an entirely non-pejorative way. It stands for just being the kind of place where a large number of people in this country live. And relatedly, it's a town. And one of the things that's happened in the 25 years since we were first there is the town has become both of greater sociological interest and a kind of problem in all kinds of ways, and quite a potent problem in British politics. So the idea of what it means to live and inhabit a town and about the prospects and fortunes and futures of towns has become an interesting political and sociological question. And Macclesfield in all kinds of ways is as good a place to think about those questions as others. First thing. Second thing, to some extent, an interest in sense of place has spanned both of these projects. In the first time round, we were interested in sense of place because we were interested in the relationship between people's felt concerns about and talk about questions of crime and disorder, and their sense of both place in the world and the sense of the place in which they lived, on the kind of hunch that there was some kind of relationship between people's levels of attachment to a particular locality and the kinds of things they thought and felt about questions of disorder. Now I think that in some way that kind of question still broadly remains present. But we as researchers, I think, have this time round become much more immersed in Macclesfield as a place in different kinds of ways. One much more immersed in it as in a kind of sensory way, and we're much more attuned in doing the work, both methodologically and substantively, to the question of what this place feels like to be in, to walk around, to cycle around, to inhabit, if you like. And secondly, we've become much more engaged in the place and its problems. And as Emily was saying, that this is a caricature, but there was a way in which the project first time round was oriented to trying to find out what people with very little to worry about worried about. And so we had a kind of distant kind of anthropological curiosity in the town oriented around that question. And we did the work, we wrote a small report for the council, and we scuffled away and we wrote a book. And we didn't for the most part, didn't set foot in the place again till 25 years later. It's been and felt very different this time, in that we've become much more immersed, not just for the purposes of kind of doing the study, but just much more engaged in thinking with people about the problems that they encounter in their everyday lives in this place, and trying to think through possible ways in which the place could be made different or better. So the whole project has had a kind of deliberative ethos, which has been trying, as Michael Borrow puts it in his public sociology work, trying to engage in a dialogue with people who are already in dialogue amongst themselves about the place in which they live and how it's changing and how it's made better and worse. Now, some of that's been to do with our own scholarly and political commitments, but it's also the fact that the kind of environment, the institutional environment in which we've done these two products is very different. Back in the mid-1990s, we were in the foothills of what has now become the impacted engagement agenda, where we are basically, shall we say, encouraged by funders, by our institutions, to orientate ourselves to the places we study and the people we study in very different kinds of ways, and to have all kinds of policy and practical impacts on the lives of the people who we study. And that's made these two projects feel very different. Thirdly, as kind of Eddie alluded to, this has ended up being a project in which crime has not disappeared, but is less central to the kinds of things that people tell us troubling them. So we've ended up working with this kind of conceptual triptych, which I'm just going to briefly describe to you, between episodic crime, veiled suffering, and ambient, or I think we're preferring now to call chronic harm. So the contrast here is the mid-1990s, where in all kinds of ways, worry and anxiety about crime was much more central to people's sense of the place in which they lived. Defending it from outside threat seemed much more central to how they oriented themselves to the relationship between this place and the external world. And lots of that revolved around certain forms of volume crime. People now talk much less about crime for the most part, and they do so in ways which we describe as episodic, which might mean that people will now much more commonly and routinely talk about crime as something that sometimes happens here because it happens everywhere. In ways that is obviously of serious import when it happens to the people who are victimised by it. But it's become much less central to people's imagined sense of what this town is like, both as a place to live and relative to other kinds of places in the world. By contrast, we have encountered in various ways, been exposed to, as researchers, what we're describing here as veiled suffering, by which we mean a whole series of sometimes crime-related problems, domestic assault being one of them, domestic assault, vulnerability and addiction of various kinds, homelessness, isolation, a whole series of problems which, to some extent, we came to know about because if you spend any time with agents in this town, if you spend many, many hours in the backs of police cars as we did, you just realise that, to put it crudely, what they do is bounce from one domestic assault to another. And therefore, that they are engaged in a form of policing which feels very different to policing in the mid-1990s, and to a large extent takes place outside the visibility of many of the people who might be making demands for more policing. That's become their core work. Of course, as criminologists, that's the kind of, if you study police, you know that's going on in all kinds of places. But it's also veiled because those forms of suffering that aren't behind closed doors, that take the form of people rough sleeping on the streets and so on, to some extent, and this came through some of our kind of interviews and discussions, exist in the kind of peripheral vision of the people who are, in a sense, more securely, economically and socially secure in this town. They know it goes on, they might occasionally encounter it, and they might relate to it in different kinds of ways, from disgust to care to concern to a kind of just a sense that this isn't the kind of thing that you really ought to find in a place like this. And then finally, and this is what people both reported in the survey, maybe I'll dash forward, and most commonly spoke to us about, well, spoke to them, each other about on social media and us to about in our qualitative work, was a whole series of problems or troubles that we've taken to calling ambient or chronic harm. In other words, the things that might be taken one by one, minor and isolated, but have a kind of incremental, pervasive, ongoing impact on the experience and quality of their lived environment. Drug dealing routinely comes top of these. In a whole range of questions, a whole bunch of problems related to the impact of the car on the lived experience of this town, whether it's speeding, congestion, conflict on the school run, bad parking, comes up a lot, as does litter, potholes, graffiti, and so on and so forth. And a number of things are kind of striking about this. One is that it seems common to us, and this is a kind of useful reminder as criminologists, that when talking about these problems, people don't make a sharp distinction between the things that are criminal and the things that are annoying and irritating and not criminal. It's all just part of a bunch of things that are spoiling or damaging the lived environment in which they inhabit. And secondly, to return to the point that Evie made, there is a recognition in respect of some of these problems that we are not being threatened from the outside, but we, as to borrow a phrase I stole off Ben right at the beginning of this project, that we are agents of our own peril, that we are the victim of things that either people, me or people like me, are engaging in. Car-related problems are an obvious case in point. Litter might also be a case in point. The future and prospects of the town centre might be another. There are many people who would bemoan the current condition and possible decline of the town centre in Macclesfield and think in some abstract sense they want it to flourish, but they may never go there themselves. Fourthly, sorry, let me get back to the plots. This is where really just kind of just kind of fleshing out that point. There's been a kind of shift, partly as a consequence of that discursive shift, away from the original project, which was focused on crime talk, to what we are now describing as the kind of ecology of security. In other words, a sense that when you talk to people about what troubles them in this place, that the kinds of things they say are very intimately related to their own immersion, their own sense of the kind of, not just the safety, but the kind of quality and condition and livability of the place that they inhabit. I'll leave that there and come back to it in a second. I can do this in another 10 minutes. Back in the 1990s, one of the things that Ellie kind of indicated that we encountered was a large and pervasive amount of visceral anger about what was perceived to be the disappearance of the police from local social relations. And this is the time, if anybody can remember, where it was kind of Home Office orthodoxy. This was before New Labour. That kind of generic police patrolling was a kind of ineffective and inefficient use of police resources, and really you don't need to have it. And I can remember all kinds of meetings in which the local chief superintendent would turn up and explain that to a bunch of angry residents who left the meeting much more angry than they had turned up, because they not only didn't get what they wanted, they felt they could be lectured at by the local superintendent. And that was a very pervasive part of that first study. Now, in various ways, the relationship people have to authorities in the town doesn't feel quite now the same. One of that has to do with things that Evie mentioned, that we've encountered, observed, participated in, a whole bunch of practices which involve local people not just demanding things from authorities in relation to the things that they care about, but actively involve themselves in practices of urban care and repair, whether that be for various kinds of vulnerable people or for the environment or particular kind of places that matter to them. In relation to the demands they do still make of authorities, one does still find people will tell you that they want to see more police. If you ask them, they'll tell you what they want demand to make of the police. But at nowhere near the level of kind of anger that we once encountered. And on more than one occasion, certainly Evie and I sat through focus group discussions whereby if we hadn't raised it, no one would have mentioned the police. There was no way that happened 25 years ago. No, it just didn't. And that's telling. By contrast, much of what people do get agitated and angry about is the authority that they think is now missing from their lives, and that's local government. And and the kind of what they perceive to be the kind of absence of kind of basic infrastructural upkeep and repair, the kind of basic oversight of the place that they inhabit. And sometimes that's directed at the two particular local authorities that are responsible for this place. But sometimes it feels like the kind of bemoaning the absence of local governments as a kind of category in their daily lives. And I can talk about more about that matters in a minute. Two more things, then I'll conclude. Firstly, it seemed to us in the 1990s that we both encountered and to some extent encouraged the kind of nostalgic idiom in which English people are sometimes want to talk about questions of crime and disorder, which took the form, to put it in a kind of cliche way, of people saying it wasn't like 30 years ago, young people had more respect for authority, or the streets were safer, or there was less crime, or I could leave my door open, and so on and so forth. There was a whole sense of a kind of narrative of decline in respect of questions of disorder, especially that pervaded Macclesfield study number 1. Now, we didn't get so much about this time. I sometimes wonder because, anyone who uttered the sentence, it was like, this incident wasn't like how it was 30 years ago, could be confronted by us actually showing them what it was like 30 years ago. And it wasn't which we didn't encounter kind of declinist talk of various kinds, in all kinds of ways of places. But it seemed that the whole, and I can't decide whether this was us or whether this was them, that the whole project was much more future oriented than I recall the first study being. That people's orientations were to what's this place going to be like in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time for my children, and much less kind of backward looking in its kind of in the kind of orientation of the discussion. Now, this may have something to do with the final thing I want to say. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that the kind of, as it were, the kind of big conceptual backdrop to the first study was globalization. It was a kind of debate that was raging in the social sciences at the time about how the conditions of kind of faster and more intense kind of global communication and exchange and circulation of people, goods, and so on and so forth, that place, local community, may be ceasing to matter to the condition and experience of people's lives. Now, that's not gone away. But I also wonder whether in this study, this has now been supplemented by what Dipesh Chakrabarty calls the planetary. In other words, a kind of consciousness about both the state of the environment in a kind of global sense, that to some extent is feeding in or filtering in to a kind of heightened concern that people have for the quality and condition of the immediate environment that they inhabit, and sometimes active attempts to make it better or repair it, and a kind of attendant set of kind of small p political concerns that are environmental in that sense. Now, I'll just say two more things, and then I'll stop. The consequence of all this is we have here 2 contents pages, one for a book that exists and is lying on the table, one for a book that we're in the early stages of trying to write. And as you can see, they're very different. And I think one of the things that we are trying to reflect upon, and this talk is to some extent an attempt to try and do that, is why they are so different and how much that's to do with us and how much to do with the world we're trying to make sense of. Now, it's in this context that Alison's reflections on the Whitehall study, I think, have been extremely helpful and much more helpful than the kind of community studies literature for which we originally turned to try and make sense of some of this. So I'm going to do something which may be problematic, and Alison was in here in the room to tell me as it is. So my reconstruction of the relationship between Whitemoor 1 and Whitemoor 2 goes something like this. Whitemoor 1 was empirically open and curiosity driven, but it sparked conceptual reflection over the next decade on legitimacy, relations in prison, that provided a different theoretical lens for Whitemoor 2. So in that sense, Whitemoor 2 is a different study. But there have been a whole series of changes in both the internal relations and external environment between Whitemoor 1 and Whitemoor 2 that meant that the object that was being studied was in all kind of ways not the same as between the two studies. There was thirdly, an extension of methods in Whitemore 2, get these letters in the right order, MQPL survey of a kind that we've also attempted in. And that Whitemore 2 generated then in itself new conceptual work that had no place in Whitemore 1 around recognition and human flourishing. Now, one of the reasons we found that of interest to us is because of Alison's kind of consciousness and sensitivity about how hard it is to think about the relationships between those two things. So as she writes, had I changed? Was I more sensitive to violence? Did I see better with trained eyes? Had life events or the aging process interfered my capacity to make connections with new groups of prisoners, or was the prison simply different? We've been wrestling with a whole bunch of questions like that. But, and this is why, this is the kind of spoiler bit that I started, I think the important thing about Alison's work in Whitemore that we're now trying to kind of bring into our work is I don't think she gets bogged down in these questions and keeps her eye on the main prize, as she puts it, to describe the current state of life and relationships in this high security prison with care and to consider the implications of our analysis. And that, in the end, seems to be the important point. The challenge we, in the end, have is to make sense of everyday security concerns and their implications in this place now. And in trying to do that well, the relationship that this place now has to a place that we studied 25 years ago, as in all sorts of ways different people, is important to think about, but in the end, secondary. Thank you.